John, thank you very much for coming to and doing this this interview with me in regard to the BiNKA project on mindfulness and sustainable consumption. As you know, we've been busy with a project trying to develop and test an intervention of mindfulness training that's that's based on MBSR to a certain extent, in order to see if there are any kind of influences that it might have on aspects of sustainable consumption. I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is based on your experience with mindfulness and with life itself, what kind of relationships do you see between mindfulness and ecology and sustainability?
Well, I think they're both aspects of the realization, if you will, of interconnectivity. So the more you befriend yourself, the more through mindfulness practice, through the formal meditative practices and so forth, the more you come to see that you are completely embedded in a warp and woof that's much bigger than your small self, so to speak, or the envelope of your skin. So the practice, in some sense, of mindfulness really does put us in touch with how dependent we are on the world outside of the envelope of our skin. I mean, if you start with breathing, for instance, I mean, we're only one breath away from being dead, and we totally take for granted that the air is mine to breathe. But if you couldn't catch the next breath, I mean, or if it was seriously polluted, I have friends who just lived through the whole fires in Southern California, where they had to evacuate from their homes, not knowing whether their homes would be completely consumed, but not being able to breathe the air. And this is in very wealthy areas of the United States, where people sort of assume that they're safe, but you're only safe until you're not. So how are we going to be in relationship with the actuality of experience? And that includes nature and the atmosphere and the ground and, air and fire and water and all of those things. So I think that there's a way in which the more we come in touch with the present moment, the more we see that interconnectedness. On the other hand, I don't want to romanticize that, because I don't think at all that will immediately turn you into somebody who is ecologically living with a light footprint. This is something that we've learned over the years. Mindfulness is really a generalizable principle of, it really means awareness. But how you conduct yourself really depends in some degree on how you've been exposed to the meditation practice and what the scope of the meditation practice is. So if we're working with people in the hospital who have serious medical conditions, chronic medical conditions and so forth, we take mindfulness and we frame it in a way that's as appropriate to those people's conditions as possible. If we were working with police and firefighters, who are like what you would call first responders, we wouldn't necessarily be talking about their heart disease or their cancer or their chronic pain. We'd be talking about other aspects of experience that are important to keep in the front of your mind when you are functioning in that capacity. And I think the same is true for sustainability, that it's something that, if you're taking MBSR as a framework, that in some sense you need to prime the pump with what to attend to in terms of sustainability. Where would one's awareness expand into, so that we're not pretending to be aware and living in balance with the world, at the same time being seriously out of balance and being, ironically, completely unaware of it. So I think that that's one big concern, and I applaud what you and your colleagues are trying to do to develop a mindfulness-based training program that would actually potentially, as I understand it, enhance one's capacity to live lightly, on, or more lightly on the planet, or at least be aware of the various costs associated with our activity, our actions. And I'll say that there's, Dan Goleman, is very well known for having written the book Emotional Intelligence. And the subtext of emotional intelligence is it's all about mindfulness. But he almost never does it. There's one time in which that word mindfulness is mentioned in emotional intelligence because it's simply parsed in a different way. Then he wrote a book called Social Intelligence. That is like an intelligence or an awareness that can hold our relationships with others and to not sort of always get stuck in the ego of, the sort of self-preoccupation of the personal pronouns. So that's a whole other domain of mindfulness, but you need to see it through certain lenses to have it come into focus. And then he wrote a book called Ecological Intelligence. And that is, again, more along the lines of what we're talking about in this conversation about sustainability, that without actually embracing in awareness the specifics of what is known about sustainability, it's not that likely that people are automatically going to come to optimal ways to live lightly within the footprint of, a life unfolding.
So in that regard, how would you expand your definition or your repertoire of mindfulness practices to include more ecological, environmental, sustainable behaviors?
Well, my answer to that question is always the same, at least this first part of it, and that is any way I can, or this is your project, any way you can, or any way you and your colleagues can. I like to emphasize, and I believe this from the bottom of my heart, that a lot of it is a matter of imagination and creativity, that we have these incredibly rich capacities to imagine things that have not yet instantiated in our lives. And sometimes we lack the courage to really stretch that and stretch ourselves into what might be possible. And I'm a big fan of having a very large view, even if it seems a little outsized, because the general principle that MBSR has always worked on with the people who are referred to our program as medical patients or who choose to come on their own, is when you ask a lot of people, you'll get a lot. If you ask a little, the most you're ever going to get is the little that you ask. And then, of course, for an instructor, the responsibility is you got to ask at least as much of yourself as you're asking of other people in terms of behavior change of any kind. Just carving out, say, 45 minutes a day, 6 days a week to practice mindfulness in a formal way, that's a huge lifestyle change. And when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about equally huge, if not even huger lifestyle changes, like what is your relationship to consumption? Even the word consumption, of course, it's the old word for the disease tuberculosis. So, there's a kind of metaphorical element to that. Like if we become more mindful of how we consume or what we insist on acquiring in order to feel like we're comfortable or we're whole or we're who we want to be, if that includes needing to have 50 Rolls Royces in your garage, that's something that should be looked at, and yet there are spiritual teachers who have gone that route, as you well know. So I'm using that as a kind of extreme example to point out that it really is possible, I think, to develop a mindful curriculum around sustainability that would be, one, on the individual level, two, on the sort of collective social and, say, work level, of institutional level, like how we collectively do things, the commons, the challenge of the commons, and so that classical thing, which is where sustainability came out of, the whole issue. And then planetary, global, beyond just individual societies or countries. And we're facing crises now in all three. So I think the motivational energies to go in this direction are actually huge, just as they were with MBSR in the early days, because the idea there was to catch people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system with chronic diseases who are not getting better with any of the standard treatments, as you know. And in fact, it served that function extremely well for large, proportions of those people. You have to, of course, be motivated to do it, but most people are motivated to learn how to live with pain if there's no magical way to cut it out of you. And I think that we're living at this moment on the earth with huge amount of pain and suffering, and able to, in some sense, see, although a lot of people deny it, that there are things that we could do now that would attenuate the suffering for our grandchildren and even for ourselves, because the rate of change is really unpredictable. But where we can actually try to find a new level of consciousness, a planetary, global consciousness that allow us to minimize the harm to all individuals, not to the privileged few, and maximize the common good. And this is beyond ideology. It's not like, trying to sell some kind of ideology, but just to say from a purely sustainable biological perspective, if we look at the sort of body politic of the whole planet, if the air is polluted, it's polluted for everybody, rich and poor. If the water is undrinkable, it's undrinkable for everybody, rich and poor, after a certain point. Of course, yes, the rich can buy bottled water until there is no more, or whatever, until society breaks down. So there are risks with stretching inequality too far, because the backlash will just take the whole thing down. And we're seeing that happen now. And while it may be very good to deconstruct certain aspects of society, it would be far better to do it without war, mayhem, and the kind of intense social disruption and violence that is often what comes when people are stretched beyond their limits of endurance in large numbers.
Thanks.
Is this making any sense to you? What I'm saying?
This makes total sense to me.
Okay.
I think that you are the pioneer in terms of bringing mindfulness into the mainstream in the Western world, and now back in the Eastern world as well, to a certain extent.
One of them,
and maybe one of them, but certainly a main one, I would say. And you define mindfulness in your books and in MBSR as paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment without judgment. This is the
I don't actually say without judgment. A lot of people corrupt my words.
Okay.
Not you, but people do corrupt them that way. It's non-judgmentally, and there's a difference, at least in my mind, between without judgment, because you can't shut off your judging. You're going to have plenty of judgments, and what the non-judgmental is pointing to is that how hard it is to just be aware of how judgmental we are, and then not to judge that too. So it's a subtle kind of way of being more open and spacious and kind towards our own critical kind of ways of falling into liking and disliking and being attached and being aversive to this, that, and the other thing. And what the mindfulness is pointing to is, or the paying attention is pointing to a non-dual way to hold that without forming these kind of dualisms of good, bad, this and that, us and them.
Right. Yeah, so, I agree with that completely.
Yeah, I know you do. And I'm just saying, and even that definition, that was kind of a formulation back in the mid-90s. Now I rather than say mindfulness is paying attention, which is very instrumental, it's like how you get to mindfulness. It's more, I state much more clearly that mindfulness is awareness. I mean, it's a synonym for awareness to a very strong first approximation. And then that awareness arises or is cultivatable through paying attention on purpose in the present moment as non-judgmentally as one can. And then often people say, well, why? And I never gave a why. But the why is in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. And self-understanding, as you well know, and as most people discover, is that you are not who you think you are. And in fact, you and all of us are much bigger than who we think we are. So there's a built-in, ecological framework for understanding the nature of who we think we are, what we call the self, that is far smaller than who we actually are, which is based on profound interconnectedness of all life and really everything. If you take a more universal cosmological perspective. So from that point of view, sustainability is kind of like just axiomatic because it's related to wisdom. It's in the service of wisdom, and it's not wise to burn your own house down. It's not wise to create environments that are so violent that your children are not going to be able to thrive. And so what goes around comes around. This is not rocket science, but it's something that I think we need to, and it's happening more and more, educate the next generation about, educate the children around it, because there's so much evidence, as you know, from the neuroscience, that when you strengthen, when you support, when you reinforce the core interconnectedness and potential neuroplasticity in the growing young brain, that you actually formulate, just as you formulate the capacity for language during those years, you formulate the capacity for a greater sense of interconnectedness, of not having it be all about me and my success in a zero-sum game at the expense of everybody else. And that's something that, yes, us adults, yeah, we're capable of meditating, and maybe we're capable of changing, and maybe we're capable of using less water, and maybe we're capable of thinking more about the real hidden costs of the products we buy and how much they harm the earth. But in a certain way, we've been too programmed already. It's very, very hard to break out of those kinds of things. But if the next generation sees it as kind of axiomatic that you act in the interests of others rather than merely yourself, because self is other and other is self from a non-dualistic point of view. And they don't get that because they're thinking about it. They get that because they've had the direct experience of it. And that's their sort of soil of, sort of the default mode, the new default mode, so to speak, of the brain or of social connectedness. Then this is where I think the optimism lies. I really do feel that we are capable of this as the species that we call ourselves, Homo sapiens sapiens, as you know, the species that is aware and knows that it's aware, but we have to live our way into that one. And we're at a crisis moment, no question about it. And part of the evidence is we wouldn't be having this conversation 20 years ago.
That's for sure.
We wouldn't have had it, right? This is like the moment.
So I think you're also making a case for expanding the usual domain of mindfulness training and mindfulness interventions,
and Dharma,
which has been very related to and successful at helping people who have serious problems in terms of their own lives, but expanding that awareness to beyond the boundaries of the self and to the other and to the environment, to the natural world. And one of the challenging aspects of such an intervention is how do you get people into a mindfulness intervention if they're mainly oriented toward being more sustainable consumers.
Right,
It's not
right.
It's not a real
the attraction of being in pain and not having the classical ways that would help you be helpful is a very, very strong motivator for MBSR.
Right.
And it's about sustainability. Where's the motivator?
And I guess we've taken the tact that you can approach both things simultaneously in terms of our orientation. We weren't advertising that people would improve their sustainable consumption, and it was more of an expansion of the the same kinds of awareness and capacities that are oriented perhaps first toward the self, and then more outward in a short.
Rightfully so, because like if you, you know, our own self-interest is important. If we don't take care of our own body, if we don't take care of our own mind, if we don't take care of our own heart, there are consequences to that. So it's not like you're not important. It's what I was saying was, no, you're just much bigger than who you think you are. And so in that sense, even more important, your choices in life, and they may seem small, and I like to emphasize this, and this has been true, from the very first year of MBSR. It's not like I've changed all that much. It was always about interconnectedness. It was always about the environment. In fact, there was a whole, week devoted to food back in the old days when it was 10 weeks long, and the whole week devoted to world stress, to how we are in relationship with the environment. And that was true from the very beginning. So it's not like all of a sudden I've had some kind of religious conversion, and now I'm off into like mindfulness for everything else. It's all related. And as you're pointing out, and I think really wisely and rightly, there's plenty of suffering to go around. It's not like, okay, if you're interested in sustainability, you don't have any self-interest in the body being healthy. Of course you do. And so we can actually use that, first noble truth of the invitation to be real about one's own dukkha and equally real about one's own sukha. In other words, and Thich Nhat Hanh likes to flip it, and instead of making dukkha, the sort of object of it, this sort of suffering element of it, what about the thriving? What about the eudaimonic aspect of it? What about happiness in a sort of larger than merely conventional happiness? And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in trying to find motivators that actually bring people to wake up. This is what we're really talking about, is waking up. And then it's not like, okay, wake up and then do what John Kabat-Zinn says, or Paul Hawkins, or Mother Teresa, or what, the Dalai Lama. No, it's wake up and investigate what your karmic assignment is at the moment, what your job on the planet could be, what your role with your grandchildren or your children or your garden or your community could be. And that's that kind of imaginative distributive function of mindfulness, that when it comes up like seeds planted in a field, they come up through the floorboards, and they are, then all of us are participating in this, rather than it being one more hierarchical, top-down kind of social movement, which I think at the moment is not really what's called for. What we're trying to do is grow out of this on a planetary level as a species. And then that means we need, as I like to put, all hands on deck. It's not like some people have the goods and other people don't. No, we need absolutely everybody. And sometimes those most imaginative and creative solutions, they may come out of a village in India, where people are trying to solve the water problem or the seed problem or the sun problem or whatever it is. And, if you look at it the way we look at our patients in the stress reduction clinic, I mean, we always look at people as like geniuses. Another miraculous being has shown up. Why shouldn't we look at everybody that way? And then trust that that's how mindfulness is going to flourish, and heartfulness. It's not like, because there's some authority that's going to say this is the best thing now to do so that you improve on yourself. Because again, from the non-dual point of view, there's no improving on yourself. It's only realizing just how multidimensional and beautiful you already are.
Thanks. I agree with you completely. I'm just wondering whether you could imagine that there could be any sustainable consumption without some modicum, at least, of
without some what?
Some modicum, some minimal aspect of mindful awareness. Whether there's any other way of doing it.
I don't know if you've read the book Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. But it's really worth reading because he's among many other things. I mean, he's quite a polymath, but he's a philosopher of evolution, so to speak, and evolutionary biology. And he makes the point that, you know, we are, in some sense, creatures of our own heredity and evolution, and that one of the strong things about it is that we really have evolved to get our genes propagated into the next generation. And if there are things that don't help us get our genes into the next generation, they're not necessarily going to have evolved in us as like second nature. On the other hand, when you have inside our own cranium, underneath the vault of the cranium, you have, you know, 86 billion neurons making their way down into the body too. And you have hundreds, if not thousands of trillions of connections between those neurons. Evolution has left a lot of room for new possibilities, and learning how to actually go beyond some of those kind of more, you know, self-protective, self-generative instincts to just get your genes into the next generation. Because now we know through cognition, through the renaissance of, you know, human experience, through everything that's happened since the last ice age to humanity, that's wise, like science and art and, you know, everything that's in the museums and the concert halls, we know that we are capable of a certain kind of creativity that goes beyond the evolution of our genes. We have cultural evolution. So I think what you're saying or asking is, are there some ways to harness wisdom? What we, at least as a species, are promising that we have within us, and to choose something that's of larger benefit, that's not just about getting my genes into the next generation, okay? And so this is like a tremendously interesting inflection point on the planet, you know, in the course of human history, because human history is only like 600-700 generations old. It's only since the end of the last ice age that we've had history. We've had prehistory for tens of thousands of years, and maybe millions for Homo sapiens. But we're a very, very young species. And so I think that part of our challenge and why we do the science of this in some way, or at least why I think you and I do it, is because we're trying to look in the mirror and wake up and see what is the true capacity here, and is it adequate to the challenges that we now know through introspection, through science, through turning outwardly, through climate science and geology and everything else, not just through introspection, meditating on your cushion. We know certain things that if we don't act to deal with global warming, to a first approximation, we know that it's going to be like very, very bad and increasingly bad for a long time for other generations. Now, do we care about other generations? Well, you know, the Native Americans speak about it as like, you know, taking care of the next 7 at least. There's a lot of Native wisdom around the world. So we need to start tapping that kind of thing and developing new 21st century cultures around sustainability and around sustainability of our own energy, because it's also being diverted and distracted perpetually by our devices now, so that we're living in an age where we're hardly ever at home in our bodies in a timeless moment like we call now, because we're always filling it up with something else and then blaming everybody else for our distractedness, while really we're addicted to it. I think these are all intersecting problems.
And do you think that the cultivation of mindfulness and training of mindfulness meditation is in some way a very concrete, practical exercise or practice to cultivate caring for not only for ourselves but for others and for nature and for all life, actually.
Totally. And it would require getting off the cushion at a certain point. So people sometimes think of meditation, if they don't really understand what it is, they think of it as what we would call formal meditation, you know, where you do take real time by the clock to drop in on yourself and you know, so in some sense, create a container where you're not attending to the whole rest of the world's issues. Okay, but if you only sit on the cushion, and meanwhile the house is on fire, there's something wrong with that picture. So it is, and if you say, well, I only have a tiny little hose, what is my hose going to do? No, you go in, you try to rescue people, you put water on the fire, you call the fire department, of course, if there is a fire department for the planet. So yeah, I think that mindfulness is the way to go. I really feel like, to a first approximation, it is, as long as people understand that mindfulness is not about sitting on your ass and getting wise, as much as it is living your life as if it really mattered, with full awareness, which is as much heartfulness as it is mindfulness. So it's not so all self-preoccupation. And again, as we started out saying, if there's a framework created that really inspires love for the interconnectedness, for the recognition of self in other and other in self, and that my interests are not that different from yours. And if, like, you know, if you talk about Monsanto's seeds and the fact that farmers can't live with Monsanto's seeds because they can't plant the next generation of them, they have to buy more seeds from Monsanto. That's good for Monsanto, but it's not necessarily good for India or any place else on the planet. This is kind of, in some sense, what we're talking about is a new wisdom that grows out of information, that grows out of knowledge, that goes out of attending to experience, and then being in deep interconnectedness with each other, so that it's not all up to me. I do my little part, but I'm also inspired by being part of this much larger network of people who care. And that I really want to emphasize this, I'm not joking, that it is ultimately, it's a love affair. And, you know, it's got to be a love affair with sanity, for one thing, in an insane world, or an apparently very insane world, and also a love affair with wisdom, with beauty, with what we have already and can so easily destroy through our own precocity as a species. And this is what the promise is. I mean, we could annihilate ourselves very easily because of our tribalism, that tribalism mind, us and them. And, you know, or we can come out of the kind of incubator of humanity in the past 600 or 700 generations, taking mindfulness, wisdom, dimensions from all cultures, and discovering or uncovering or recovering a new way to be human on this planet that is actually sustainable in the long run. When I started at MBSR, there were under 4 billion people on the planet, maybe 3. Now there are 7.4. That's less than 40 years ago. That's not sustainable. And so we do need to wake up as a species, and it's easy to say, it's totally non-trivial. And that's why, in some sense, I really do bow to you and your colleagues for trying to research this, even at the most elementary level, and ask, well, because it's all in the details. It's like, yeah, anybody could come in and teach mindfulness, but they wouldn't necessarily inspire what's required for sustainability in mindfulness. That's like, who knows how to do that? And that's a koan. It's not like anybody has to. It's that we all need to ask the question with every breath, but without beating ourselves up or, becoming so, sort of frightened or, catatonic around the fear narratives that we, again, fall into dualism, and it's now or never, or it's them and us, and it's the good guys against the bad guys, and not separate from social justice issues, which also need to be, grounded in mindfulness, but at the same time, we need to find a way to do it that's not othering everybody else. That's not them and us, the police versus the community. Or it's like we're all in this together as human beings, but we've fallen into these polarities that are being, in some sense, inflamed by politics rather than damped down by wisdom. And that's what we need. And, you know, I hope 6-year-olds are listening to this, because I think if anybody's going to take us in the right direction, it's the youngins.
And I think I've always been a firm believer that mindfulness and mindfulness practice is a very practical, concrete set of exercises and not just sitting on a cushion, but applying them to daily life too. That really forms the backbone of everything you're saying. That really mindfulness is not just cultivating awareness and attention, but to be able to cultivate awareness and attention, you need to cultivate an openness and an unconditionality and a generosity to experience as it unfolds.
And knowing too.
Not knowing too, and courage too.
Well, once we start in on this list, it's a lot, and I completely agree with you. And I think that, well, that's why I'm saying it's a love affair. I mean, your life and my life, we've known each other so long, and in, you know, so many ways that, you know, I feel safe saying this, that, you know, our whole lives have been shaped by our love for the meditation practice. And that's not because we're Buddhists or anything like that. It's because that meditation practice, the invitation, is so powerful that it's life transforming and healing. And the question is now, I think, is like, and you've done a lot of wonderful science around it, and you know, have taken a very wonderful, I feel, rigorous role in debunking a lot of the hype around mindfulness, because we don't want to give the impression that we know everything about mindfulness, or that everything that is written about it in the press is true. A lot of what's written about in the press is not true. A lot of neuroscientists, even what they say is not actually true, or it's only true to a degree. But the overall vector of the evidence is in the direction that now mindfulness is something that really is potentially enormously powerful and life transforming. And every one of us, in some sense, needs to, if we care to, explore it for ourselves. But it's really valuable to have really, 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 really good teachers out there, because especially if you're trying to do something as creative as marrying mindfulness with sustainability, you have to have people out there who can articulate it and who can draw at their fingertips thousands of examples. I mean, and people come to mind, like Paul Hawking, for instance, and this fellow that I've met recently called David Orb. They've been writing about these things for a very long time. And, you know, there's a whole history of it. I mean, it goes back to Emerson and Thoreau in the United States, and, you know, and it's like worldwide. So, you know, a lot of it I don't know. I'm kind of, in some sense, a newcomer to it. But I do feel that in terms of the meditation practice itself, I think it's probably good to remind whoever's going to be watching this that you and I are not talking about there being one right way to experience mindfulness or to practice mindfulness. There are an infinite number of doors into this very large room. And the important thing is to find the door that really resonates with you at the moment. And then don't stand in the doorway, move into the room and let the practice, in some sense, show you and do you what you need to do, what your, so to speak, karmic assignment might be, no matter what jobs you hold to make money. And then trust that the world will, as Goethe said, I mean, since you guys are in Germany, I mean, Goethe said, you know, the world is waiting for you to act, and then it will collaborate in every way. I mean, I think Goethe hit the nail right on the head that, you know, when we take action, when we embody what it is that we most love, you find that the whole rest of the world is going to collaborate with you, or large enough regions of it, and surprising regions of it, sometimes even in government, sometimes even in countries that you wouldn't expect that to happen. So the important thing is that we take responsibility for what we can. And I just love that. That's why, you know, even after more than 50 years of meditation practice, it's not like it's stale or it gets boring or anything like that. So I feel like I'm barely at the threshold. I mean, it's like a rank beginner, so to speak, in this adventure of us all being in it together, you know, this adventure of life.
Wonderful. Do you?
Well, I know you and I are on the same page. I mean, that we agree completely, and there's a certain asymmetry in that. You know, you're interviewing me, so I'm doing more of the talking, but you could equally be saying all of these things yourself, and I know that. And since you're involved in the research, I think one of the important points to communicate to this conference or whatever is, again, to just circle back to what I said at the beginning. Imagination and creativity building on who each one of those people in the conference is. That's where the heart of this lies. Use your science, use your poetry, use your love, use your relationships to come up with really, truly innovative, insightful ways to break out of life-destroying habits and break into life-affirming new ways of living, whether it's your relationship to water and turning on the tap in the morning and then not being aware that you're leaving it on without needing to leave it on, or, you know, what you choose to wear, what the hidden costs of things are, what the supply chain element of all this is. I mean, nowadays, and that's what ecological intelligence was, that manufacturing, the supply chain, we need to know what all the costs are for the building materials that we use or whatever it is that we buy. All of this is part of mindfulness, because when we're aware of it, we can make intelligent choices. When we're not aware of it, we're like, you know, sort of blinded. And I think, you know, that's the challenge of the present moment. And it's not going to be worked out in Geneva or Paris or Beijing. You know, it'll be worked out in Geneva and Paris and Beijing and Washington and Boston, New York and Freiburg and Berlin and everywhere people care enough to step in and say, you know,
it's time.
I am alive still on this planet. I'm going to do what I can.
Well, thank you very much. I think those are wonderful concluding remarks, and we really appreciate you taking time.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the invitation, and you know, in a sense, it's such a big topic. We've barely scratched the surface in terms of sustainability and how technology can support sustainability rather than anti-sustainability. There are all so many different topics we haven't touched on, but I think the essence is really the human heart and the human mind. Everything else is second order stuff. When we get that tuning right, the symphony will, you know, sort of unfold on its own.
Thank you very much again.
Love you, man.
Delightful to have you, to talk to you and to see you again.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
And my regards to everybody who's going to be watching this.
Okay.
May you all have a wonderful, wonderful conference.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.